December 7, 1941, Ford Island, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The air smells of oil, fire, and death. Black, choking smoke blots out the morning sun. The super battleship USS Arizona is a shattered, burning wreck, its back broken, its hull resting on the harbor floor. The USS Oklahoma has capsized, trapping hundreds of men alive inside its dark, inverted hull. The sound of explosions, machine guns, and screaming men is relentless. America is, for the first time in its modern history, stunned, humiliated, and filled with rage. In Washington, D.C., in the weeks that followed, the atmosphere was not just one of defense, it was one of revenge. The war in Europe was already raging, but this attack on American soil was different. It was personal. The White House and the War Department were inundated with ideas from across the country. Scientists, engineers, and ordinary citizens sent in thousands of suggestions for new weapons. Most were impractical, some were ingenious. But the strangest, most bizarre, and perhaps most brilliant idea of them all did not come from a physicist at a top university or a general at the Pentagon. It came from a dental surgeon in Pennsylvania. His name was Dr. Lytle S. Adams. Dr. Adams was a successful dentist, but his true passion was nature. He was an amateur naturalist and an avid explorer. He had spent countless hours deep inside the Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico, one of the largest cave systems in the world. And he was fascinated by its inhabitants, the bats. Specifically, the Mexican free-tailed bat. He had watched them emerge at dusk, a swirling black cloud of millions of creatures flying out to hunt insects. He had studied them. He knew their incredible secrets. He knew they were fantastic navigators. He knew they could carry weight far heavier than their own tiny bodies. And most importantly, he knew their instinct. He knew that after hunting all night, they would return before dawn, seeking the darkest, most inaccessible, and safest places to roost. They would crawl into tiny crevices, attics, eaves, and the dark spaces behind walls. In early 1942, Dr. Adams sat in his study reading a newspaper. The headlines were grim. American forces were losing in the Pacific. Japanese cities, he thought, seemed untouchable. Then he looked at a photograph of a traditional Japanese city. He looked at the dense, crowded buildings, and he realized something critical. Unlike American cities built of steel and concrete, Japanese cities were built almost entirely of wood and paper. They were, as he later wrote, tinderboxes. An idea sparked in his mind. A wild, almost insane idea. What if you could take 1 million Mexican free-tailed bats? What if you could design a tiny, lightweight incendiary bomb, a fire starter small enough for a bat to carry? What if you could pack these armed bats, thousands of them, into special containers and drop them from bombers high above a city like Tokyo or Osaka? The bats would do what bats always do. They would spread out, flying for miles, seeking shelter from the daylight. They would hide in the attics, the rafters, and the paper walls of the Japanese houses. Then, after a set amount of time, the tiny timers on the bombs would go off. It would not be one large fire that the fire department could fight. It would be thousands of tiny, simultaneous fires, starting from the inside of every building, all across the city. It would be an unstoppable, all-consuming inferno. It was a crazy, terrifying, and brilliant plan. Dr. Lytle S. Adams, a dentist, sat down and began to write a letter. He did not send it to a local Army recruiter. He sent it straight to the White House, addressed to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. He was about to propose Project X-ray. In normal times, a letter from a dentist suggesting strapping bombs to bats would have been dismissed as the ravings of a madman. It would have been filed away in a crank folder, a source of amusement for government clerks. But this was not normal times. This was 1942. The nation was losing the war. The letter from Dr. Adams landed on the desk of President Roosevelt. Roosevelt, known for his willingness to explore unconventional ideas, read the proposal. Instead of laughing, he saw the bizarre, terrifying logic in it. He saw a potential war-winning weapon that used nature itself against the enemy. He famously forwarded the letter to the new top-secret Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, the precursor to the CIA. With it, he attached a short, characteristic note. "This man is not a nut. It sounds like a perfectly wild idea, but is worth looking into." With the president's personal endorsement, Project X-Ray, as it was codenamed, was born. The project was handed over to the Army Air Forces and some of the nation's top scientists. They were tasked with solving 3 massive engineering and biological problems. First, could they even capture and handle millions of wild bats? Second, could they design an incendiary bomb small enough, light enough, and powerful enough for a bat to carry? And third, could they create a deployment system? A bat bomb container that could be dropped from a high-altitude B-29 bomber, safely release the bats at the right altitude, and give them time to find shelter before the bombs ignited? The man put in charge of the bomb's design was Dr. Louis Feser. This was a serious choice. Dr. Feser was one of the most brilliant and feared chemists at Harvard University. He was the man who had just invented napalm, the jellied gasoline that would later incinerate Tokyo. Feser was intrigued by the challenge. He needed to create a fire starter that weighed less than an ounce, about 22 grams. It had to be reliable, cheap, and deadly. He developed a tiny, pencil-sized canister filled with his napalm mixture. It was attached to a simple, copper wire timer. This timer was a marvel of grim ingenuity. It was designed to be activated just before the bats were dropped. The wire would slowly dissolve in a chemical solution, acting as a timer, giving the bat just enough time to fly away and find a roost. While Feser worked on the bomb, Dr. Adams, the dentist, was put in charge of finding the bats. He led teams back to the caves he knew so well in New Mexico and Texas. They set up giant nets, capturing thousands of the confused, shrieking creatures. The bats were packed into refrigerated trucks, cooled down to 4 degrees Celsius. This forced them into a state of hibernation, making them dormant and easy to transport. Now, the military needed a place to test this insane new weapon. They chose a top-secret location, the Carlsbad Army Airfield Auxiliary Test Range in New Mexico. In the middle of the desert, they constructed a full-scale replica of a typical Japanese village. The buildings were made just as they were in Tokyo from wood, bamboo, and paper. This would be the proving ground. In mid-1943, the first test was ready. A bat bomb container, a large perforated metal shell, was loaded with dozens of the hibernating armed bats. The timers on their tiny incendiary devices were set. The container was loaded onto a B-25 bomber. The bomber flew over the fake Japanese village, and the container was dropped. A parachute deployed, slowing the container's descent. At 1,000 feet, the shell popped open. The bats, now awake and active, fluttered out into the bright desert sky. The scientists, generals, and Dr. Adams himself watched from a bunker, their binoculars trained on the village. The bats, blinded by the daylight, did exactly what Dr. Adams had predicted. They flew straight for the nearest dark, safe-looking structures. They crawled into the attics. They hid in the eaves. They vanished into the paper walls of the replica houses. The observers waited. The timers were set for 30 minutes. Then it happened. A wisp of smoke appeared from the roof of one building, then another, and another. Within 20 minutes, the entire Japanese village was a raging, uncontrollable inferno. The firestorm was so intense it consumed every structure. The test was a terrifying, unqualified success. The bat bomb worked. The devastating success of the New Mexico test created a wave of excitement. The Army Air Forces, now convinced of the weapon's potential, officially greenlit Project X-ray for further development. The plan was ambitious. They would create a bat bomb carrier that could hold over 1,000 bats, each armed with Dr. Feser's tiny napalm device. A fleet of B-29 bombers, each carrying 100 of these canisters, could unleash 100,000 tiny flying fire starters on a city like Tokyo. The military planners calculated that this would be more effective and cheaper than a conventional bombing raid, but the project soon hit a major snag. The Army Air Forces, while impressed, were focused on their new, high-altitude, precision bombing strategy. They were also pouring billions of dollars into another top-secret project in the New Mexico desert, a weapon that promised to end the war in a single flash. The bat bomb project, while clever, seemed like a bizarre distraction. Frustrated, the Army passed the project over to the Navy. The Navy, in turn, passed it to the Marine Corps. The Marines, known for their aggressive and unconventional tactics, embraced the idea. They saw it as the perfect weapon for their island-hopping campaign. They officially took control of the project in December 1943. The Marines moved the entire operation to a newly constructed and highly secret test facility at the Marine Corps Air Station in El Centro, California. They also made a critical change. They decided Dr. Feser's napalm and timer bomb was too complex. They wanted something simpler. They developed a new incendiary device, a tiny 17-gram bomb filled with white phosphorus attached to a simple friction pull lighter. The plan was that a wire attached to the bat would pull the lighter as it flew from the container. This new system needed to be tested. And this is where the project's bizarre genius collided with reality. In May 1944, a group of high-ranking officers and scientists gathered at the El Centro facility to watch a demonstration. The test was supposed to be simple. A batch of bats, armed with dummy inactive bombs, were to be loaded into a container to test the new release mechanism. But a mistake was made. A catastrophic, almost comical mistake. Somehow, a second batch of bats, armed with live active white phosphorus bombs, were accidentally loaded into the test container instead. The container was opened. The bats, as expected, flew out. But these bats were not heading for a replica Japanese village. They were at an active, fully functional American military airbase. And they did exactly what Dr. Adams had predicted they would do. They sought the darkest, safest, and most inaccessible places to roost. One group of armed bats flew directly into the rafters of the brand-new, multi-million-dollar base hangar. Another group crawled into the dark spaces above the officers' quarters. A third group found a comfortable spot inside the personal car of the base's commanding officer. The scientists and officers watched in horror. They knew what was about to happen. There was no way to reach the bats. There was no way to disarm the tiny friction-activated bombs. They could only wait. A few minutes later, a wisp of smoke appeared from the roof of the officers' quarters. Then the hangar. Then the commanding officer's car exploded in a ball of white phosphorus fire. The El Centro Marine Corps Air Station, the base chosen to test the secret weapon, was now being burned to the ground by the secret weapon. Firefighters rushed to the scene, but it was useless. The bats had started dozens of small fires simultaneously from the inside of the buildings. The base fire department, designed to fight one fire at a time, was completely overwhelmed. The massive hangar, several barracks, and the commanding officer's car were all burned to the ground. Project X-Ray had just claimed its first victim, a friendly American airbase. The El Centro fire was a disaster, but it was also, in a twisted way, another perfect proof of concept. The weapon was undeniably effective. Perhaps, the Marines argued, it was too effective to be tested near valuable military assets. The accidental self-destruction of their own airbase became a bizarre top-secret badge of honor for the project's developers. It proved the core idea worked. Following the incident, the project was moved again, this time to a remote, abandoned civilian airbase in Utah, far from anything valuable. The year was now late 1944. The team, now led by the Marine Corps, refined the system. They went back to Dr. Fieser's original, more reliable napalm and timer design. They perfected the cylindrical bomb canister that could be dropped from a B-29. This canister was a complex piece of engineering. It was designed to deploy a parachute, open at a preset altitude, and release over 1,000 armed bats, each one a tiny self-guided incendiary missile. The plan was solid. The weapon was ready. It was proven to be effective. It was ready for mass production. A final, large-scale demonstration was scheduled for the Dugway Proving Ground in Utah. This time, the bats would be dropped on a full-scale replica of a German industrial town. This was the final test before sending the weapon to the front lines. The test was, once again, a terrifying success. The bat bombs performed flawlessly, burning the replica German village to the ground. The firestorm was so intense it confirmed all of Dr. Adams's original theories. The Marine Corps was ecstatic. They presented the findings to the Navy leadership and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They argued that Project X-Ray was ready. They proposed a plan to equip a fleet of B-29 bombers with these bat bomb canisters and unleash them on the dense, wooden cities of Japan. The proponents argued this would cause more widespread, uncontrollable panic and fire than conventional incendiary bombing. It would be the ultimate psychological weapon. But Project X-Ray was running out of time. While the dentist and the Marines had been perfecting their biological weapon, another, far more powerful secret project had been reaching its own terrifying conclusion. In the New Mexico desert, not far from where Dr. Adams had first captured his bats, the Manhattan Project, led by J. Robert Oppenheimer, was also racing towards a deadline. The leaders of the American war effort were now faced with a choice between two superweapons. One was unconventional, biological, and slightly unpredictable. It promised to burn Japan to the ground, one house at a time, over a period of weeks. The other was a single bomb, a weapon that harnessed the power of the atom itself, a weapon that could destroy an entire city in a single blinding flash. The choice was simple. The war needed to end, and it needed to end now. In July 1945, the Trinity test proved the atomic bomb worked. The bat bomb, as ingenious and strange as it was, instantly became obsolete. It was a clever idea from a disappearing era of warfare. The world had just entered the nuclear age. In early 1945, Admiral Ernest King, the same man who had laughed at the baby flat tops, reviewed the bat bomb project. The weapon had been proven effective. It was ready, but it was no longer needed. He wrote a simple memo. "This project is canceled. After nearly 3 years of development, $2 million in funding, a massive sum at the time, and the accidental destruction of one friendly airbase, Project X-ray was officially shut down. The dentists, the chemists, and the Marines were ordered to abandon their work. The remaining hibernating bats, the tiny would-be soldiers, were, according to some reports, simply unceremoniously released into the desert. Dr. Lytle S. Adams's wild idea, the plan that had gone all the way to the president, was now just a forgotten, bizarre footnote in the history of the war. The story of Project X-ray ended not with a bang or even a whimper, but with the quiet closing of a file folder. The thousands of bats that had been gathered for the final assault were simply left to the desert. The complex bat bomb canisters were disassembled. The revolutionary incendiary devices, created by one of the world's top chemists, were scrapped. Dr. Lytle S. Adams, the dentist from Pennsylvania whose wild idea had reached the president, returned to his quiet life. His strange, brilliant, and terrifying contribution to the war effort was classified, buried in secret archives, and forgotten. The project remains one of the strangest chapters in the history of military innovation. It was a weapon that was, by all accounts, a success. It proved, both accidentally at El Centro and intentionally at Dugway, that the core concept was sound. It was a weapon that could have, as its proponents argued, created an unstoppable firestorm. But it was ultimately a weapon born of a different age. It was a clever, biological solution in a world that was rapidly entering the age of physics. The sheer, overwhelming, and terrible finality of the atomic bomb made all other superweapons obsolete overnight. And perhaps that was for the best. The El Centro fire, while almost comical in its failure, provided a dark warning. The project's greatest strength, its use of living, unpredictable creatures, was also its greatest weakness. The bats, once released, followed their own instincts. They could not be controlled. They could not be recalled. Project X-ray is now remembered as a bizarre what-if of World War II. A testament to the desperate, strange, and sometimes brilliant lengths the human mind will go to in a time of total war. It was the perfectly logical, completely insane, and almost successful plan to turn 1 million tiny, flying mammals into an army of arsonists. It was, and remains, the story of the bat bomb.